Hello, everyone, and welcome to this practitioners panel as part of the Active Speech Sharing Scholarship on Teresa Deevy conference. Joining us in discussion today is Amanda Coogan, Jonathan Bank, Lianne Quigely, Caroline Byrne, Isabel Walsh. So I'm going to hand over to Una, who will start proceedings.
You're very welcome, and our speakers are particularly welcome today. Our conversation is about how practitioners have encountered Deevy and how they have responded to her work, and I suppose what her work particularly means to them as individuals and as theatre makers. So with that in mind, our first question is to ask everybody present how Deevy came into your life and to tell us a little bit about your work with the texts that you've produced. So perhaps, Jonathan, I might put that question to you first.
Well, thank you. Thanks for including me. Deevy came into my life in 2009, and I've told this story a few times, so it may be familiar to, but I couldn't think of the names of any Irish women playwrights from the first half of the last century after Lady Gregory. And that puzzled me. That felt wrong to me. That felt unlikely to me. And at the Mint Theatre, I'm in the business of finding neglected plays. And usually a play comes to me just through serendipity, where I'll run across a reference to a title or an author, and and usually that reference is not because I'm looking for it. I'm reading about one play and a critic mentions another, and well, that sounds interesting. But in this case, I actually set out looking. And I sat down with the production history of the Abbey Theatre. It was actually Lennox Robinson's 1950-something volume, which has great indexes. And there's a list of every play and author and dates, and I just started looking for women's names. And I decided right from the start that I was going to ignore the fact that a woman might be masking her identity with initials or with a pseudonym, and that I would just look for the Marys and the Catherines and see what I could find. And I made a list, not of every name, but of every name that had multiple occurrences. And I was only looking at the Abbey production history and not, anything broader than that. And as I said, this was in 2009, and to the best of my recollection, I think I had 8 names. It might have been 6 names, but it was not 2 and it was not 12. But Deevy's name, as you probably all know at this point, occurred 6 times over the course of 6 years, really 5 years. Once I started Googling on these names, it's tricky because, and I don't have that list anymore. And I don't remember everybody who was on it, but there's some names that are just so common that they might have been on page 12 of the search results, as an author, but but basically Deevy was the one author who returned any pages, and she was definitely the one author who returned pages who had work published. in fact, more than published, I mean, she had her volume of 3 plays published by Macmillan was on the shelf at the New York Public Library.
Yeah.
And I was able to really just go from reading a sentence of description about this playwright to get on the subway, grab a copy of the book, take it home, and really within, I don't know, 3 or 4 pages of the first play I looked at, which was Katie Roach, one of 3 plays in that volume, I knew that I was in the presence of a writer, of a compelling voice, a surprising voice, and as is my wont as a play picker and as a producer and as I guess a historian, I knew I wanted to produce Deevy, but I wanted to read everything before I made a decision of what I would work on. I see the sun is coming out in full force.
Look at you.
It'll fade behind the clouds before long. Anyway, so I set about looking for the rest of her work, and I found a copy of Temporal Powers, which had been published in, I think, the 70s, the 80s, and there were, I think there were 500 copies of that published, but I managed to find a used one and have it shipped, and the Irish University Review edition of the Deevy Jubilee edition to read Wife to James Whelan, and that was the play that I was most eager to read because I knew that was that the story of the play not being done in and of itself.
Of Wife to James Whelan.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Abbey Rejected play. And I read both of those plays and I loved them both. And truthfully, I loved them both more than I loved Katie Roach.
Okay.
And I think that's a kind of a purely personal artistic perspective, but it may be informed by my kind of warped view of the dramatic canon. I mean, Katie Roach was the famous play, even though the use of that word is particularly here in America, is not famous.
Yeah.
And funny about that play that was published in Famous Plays of 1935-36, the Louis Gollins series of plays, he felt the necessity of adding a note in that edition to say, we're including it because we think it's really good, even though we know we can't call it famous. Because it hadn't been produced outside of Dublin.
Yeah. So I suppose then, Jonathan, what you're saying is the importance of publishing, the importance of the records, the importance of availability of scripts, and that was what brought Deevy to you. You talk about getting on the subway in New York and being able to go to the library to get a copy of the play and that immediate sense of access. I suppose I'm interested in, Lianne, maybe you talk about your entry point.
Thanks a million for the invitation here. I'm really honoured to share the discussion with you. I heard about Teresa Deevy. I think in 2014, so relatively recently before you, Jonathan. But really, I was really interested in theatre, being a theatre maker, and what was going on in Dublin theatre scene. And there was a series of lectures in Trinity about theatre and disability, theatre makers and disability, and that's when I first heard of Teresa Deevy. And I, to be honest, I nearly fell out of my standing because, you know, I was like, I'm sorry, a woman writer who was deaf. I mean, as a deaf theatre maker, this is astonishing. And so I came across the King of Spain's Daughter, which was the play that I couldn't get out of my mind. Now, in 2014, this was pre-Waking the Feminist, and there was very little, when I was Googling and having a look around for her, there was very little information. But I got my hands on the script. And at the time I was working with Amanda on another project that we were doing in the Project Art Centre. And we kind of said very briefly, listen, our next one is possibly this. And we just couldn't get over that it was a deaf person who was a writer who had this history in the Abbey, who was forgotten, neglected, and we wanted to reclaim her. The King of Spain's Daughter really, well, I began working with Amanda really because our collaboration was really, the aim of our collaboration in Bull was really to tell the story of deaf people and to tell the story of the deaf community in Ireland on a main stage, on a mainstream stage. Amanda's a coda. She'll speak for herself, I'm sure. She's a coda, which means her mum and dad are deaf, and her sign language is her first language, and this is her heritage, her culture as well. And really to talk about, to speak to what we call the mainstream, so hearing people about the richness of our culture and our language. And we started really breaking down the King of Spain's Daughter. And the thing about it is that, you know, it was written in the 30s, and we started looking at the history of deaf women in the 30s and tried to draw a kind of a parallel. You know, this is when the Constitution came into our lives, the Bunreacht na hÉireann came into our lives in 1932, and we really believe that Deevy was one of the women who suffered under that Constitution. So we really paralleled a reading of the play with what was happening in Irish deaf women's lives, and really picked up on the themes of oppression.
Okay.
And we really looked at the character of Mrs. Marks in the play. I'm signing her like this. This is the sign we gave Mrs. Marks because we had these funky costumes on her, which we'll show you a little bit later. But we put her as the symbol of oppression, actually. So not specifying the oppression, not just as a patriarchal moment. And we took the oppression to be an oppression of our language, Irish Sign Language. But there's even more detail than that. And I will talk about women's signs and the gendered vocabulary in Ireland that we have in sign language, which is also awesome.
Yeah.
You see, the two deaf schools, was two deaf schools, St. Joseph's for boys and St. Mary's for girls, completely segregated. And so in St. Mary's, they used a vocabulary that what we now call women's signs, but it kind of died on the wayside because St. Joseph signs are what we call normal ISL is the vocabulary that we use now. So we were in part of our production, we were remembering this very specific gendered language of sign language that we have in this country that is dying, with these women who still know it and used it in school are in their 70s and 80s at this stage. Let me give you an example. This is black, the sign for black in Ireland. And the women's sign for black is this. Oh. So we littered any translations of the play or any vocabulary that we used with women's signs only. And you might wonder why we called it Talk Real Fine Just Like a Lady as well. So we removed it from The King of Spain's Daughter.
Yeah.
Paralleled it with it, but we called it Talk Real Fine Just Like a Lady because we went to the Nina Simone Mississippi Goddamn song, this blistering anthem of civil rights. And it was really a beautiful link and popular linkage with our production, Strive for Justice, Social Equality. So our production fronted Irish Sign Language and Irish Sign Language users completely. It's like the minute you walked into the Peacock, and we played in the Peacock, which is underneath the smaller theatre in the Abbey. The voiceover, which is Amanda here actually, is trying to catch up on Lianne's fulsome explanation. So the minute you walked into the Peacock, tell us then, you went down the stairs of the Peacock, if we know, you were completely, what we want to do is immerse you completely into a deaf sign language using world. So the character from the play, The King of Spain's Daughter, was a Jimmy. We had multiple Jimmies and we called them the comrades. And they were walking around in these brown overalls, very much taken from the script, walking around the audience, and they brought the audience into the auditorium. We had a character who was dressed up as Teresa Deevy as well, just walking around chatting in sign language. Obviously, these are all deaf people. And now, in terms of our exploration of oppression as well, so this is the sign for oppression. This is the sign in ISL for oppression. So what we did was, when we came into the auditorium, we had this massive piece of fabric that was propped up by these three Mrs. Marks characters that we had: a sign for authority, authoritarianism, oppression. And we had 5 Annies dotted within the seats of the auditorium. And this big piece of fabric was over everybody. So you walked in and you were settled down under the fabric. And then at an alarm bell, which flashed lights, the fabric came down and you popped your head as the audience member through it. So in terms of the parallel with Irish deaf history and why we really forefronted the oppression of Mrs. Marks on Annie, in our experience, the experience of deaf women in Ireland, we were forced really to learn how to speak. And as you can imagine, as deaf women, this is the disability we cannot overcome. And so it was recognized in the Ryan report on institutional abuse that this was an abusive a term within the deaf schools in Ireland. And so we used to be told to talk real fine. So this is the sign, talk real fine. This is what the teachers and nuns in St. Mary's would say to us at all times. Talk, speak up, hold out your chin, try and articulate with your voice. And we really included the ideas of religion in terms of that. We, Mrs. Marks, when we signed a translation of the Hail Mary at one stage, which we inverted then in the middle of the lines, Mrs. Marks was delighted with it. She gestured to us the Annies, her delight in it. And then once we inflected the Hail Mary, when we hit womb, we awoken in our play and realized we were embodied people with ideas, fantasies, sexual fantasies, ideas beyond the structure that was imposed on us. Then she came down hard on us. And we opened the play with this looking, which is again directly from the script. The opening is that Jimmy is looking around the field. And this sign beautifully inflects to become Ireland.
Yes. I remember
We're
that
looking
particularly.
at Ireland, I suppose, is how we completely opened our production, marking it from the first utterances.
And what I'd like to do...
Yes, tell us.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm conscious that I'd like to bring Caroline in maybe at this point, just because, and we can come back to everything. I'm also conscious we've lost Isabel.
No, we can see Isabel.
Okay, I mustn't be able to see it. That's
Might
fine.
have lost me. Sorry.
Sorry, I've turned off my sound just so I don't interrupt anything here while Amanda was doing the voiceover. So, but I'm still here.
Okay.
Both.
We can see you.
That's perfect. I suppose I'm just going to, I wasn't quite sure that we were going to have Amanda do the voiceover or Isabel. So that was my misconception. That's fine. Caroline, we might bring you in now just to talk about how Deevy came into your life and a little bit about your work, while Amanda and Lianne were working in the Peacock, you were working upstairs in the Abbey. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I guess my experience of Deevy is not as rich as, hearing about Lianne and Jonathan's and Amanda's introduction. I had just directed a play at Shakespeare's Globe called The Taming of the Shrew. And that coincided with the Waking the Feminist movement that was happening, paralleling in Dublin. And Neil and Graham had just taken over at the Abbey. And they availability checked me, so it's pretty dry. They checked me for a play, and I wasn't available. And I said, "What's the play?" And they said, "Oh, we don't want to tell you because we don't want to get your hopes dashed in case you can't do it." So they built up this narrative around it, and then finally I said, "Look, I am available. What's the play?" And they said, "Katie Roach by Teresa Deevy." And I said, "I've never heard of that." So it was like they had built it up to something that they presumed, like I, as an Irish theatre director, that I would know this play, and I just didn't know it at all. And I guess they had seen a paralleling in some senses of what I had done with The Taming of the Shrew at the Globe, a woman being tamed, and looking at how I might bring that to an Irish production of Katie Roach. So I read the play immediately, thinking, oh, they said this was kind of like the Hedda Gabler, the Doll's House of Irish theatre. And I read it, and I guess my reaction to it was not as enthused as maybe you all are about her work. At the time, I was thinking I found it really challenging to understand where the play was and to really think about. I felt like it was a very trapped play between two kind of the three actor and then the expressionistic play. And I wondered where my permission would be from the Abbey in terms of how I could interpret it and how I could read it for 2017, and also be really respectful of Teresa Deevy's work as well. So there was some negotiation around whether I could make some cuts and changes, and what my freedom would be as an artist to interpret her work, because I didn't want it to be a museum piece, and I didn't want it to just fit into the narrative around Waking the Feminists. I wanted the play actually to stand alone and be its own thing, rather than being in inverted commas as a kind of redressing something. I knew that was like really important, but also I felt like it was important to let the play have its own 2017 life. So I guess that's how I came across it. I negotiated with Graham and Neil that I would work with a dramaturg and maybe make some changes, and talk to as many people as possible about her work, and visit archives and talk to Chris Morash. And then I really began to fall in love with the play then, as I began to make my own connections with it. But at the start, I think that I was a little baffled by her work, I'll be honest. I was baffled by the syntax. I was baffled by some of the characters, and some of it for me felt quite underwritten. And some of it was overwritten. So it was like how to take this on and make it really relevant for now. That was my important kind of trajectory, and it was to try and make it relevant for like a contemporary discourse rather than doing anything that was like a museum piece.
Yeah, and Amanda, would you take on that point about that Caroline made around the getting into the syntax, the underwritten, the overwritten? Because I'd love to hear what you thought, and your way in.
Yeah, I mean, Lianne was the great discoverer of this little gold nugget, and in terms of our practice together, I mean, it was manna from heaven in terms of a deaf writer, a woman writer. I gloriously come from the visual arts. I'm a performance artist, but I come from the visual arts, so I don't care about literature. I have a fabulous disregard for words, syntax. I almost really bold about it as well, and go, how can I throw this against the wall and smash it? So it was never with me as the artist, and I'm loath to say director, because I think Lianne and Alvin, our colleague, are more of the actual theatre directors. I am more of the, let's try this, let's try that kind of person. So I always call myself the artist within our collaborations. But with something that was going to come through my practice, it was never going to be a straightforward reading. And so, and especially like I cannot tell you the zeal of the Dublin Theatre of the Deaf. The zeal of that lady there, Lianne Quigely, particularly, right, Lianne? Just they're bursting to tell their stories. And so it was a brilliant opportunity for somebody who doesn't care about literary theatre. I think the Irish theatre canon is castrated by the word. Well, that's a whole other conversation. I was just so excited to start drawing the parallels. And really what we did in the first instance is we sat down and we literally translated the play into ISL, because the company are all ISL users. So we literally, and myself and Alvin Jones did a reading of it, I suppose is the equivalent in ISL. And, Jimmy said this and Annie said that and Mrs. Mark. And then it was like, with that, a match was lit in terms of, that sounds like what happened in St. Mary's. That sounds like, that is almost like the way that this happened here or there. Like a great example is in The King of Spain's Daughter. Annie talks about the red, I might be misquoting it, and Jonathan, you might be better quoting it than I, but I think the original script talked about the flame red dress.
Flame red and the shimmering green and the pale gold.
And Annie is dreaming of these great, glorious dresses that she wants to wear. And I read it as this kind of a fantasy moment. And I wanted to inflect it with a sexual fantasy as well, because we are an embodied company. Everything comes back to the body. I wanted to read everything with the body, and a female body, an oppressed female body. I wanted to inflect it with the sexual reading. And so what we did was we had a film in the background. So we took it off the stage, of course. I'm also so oppositional. I took it off the stage, and so the play happened within the seats of the auditorium. This might be the moment to show you a little picture, actually. Is that all right, Lianne? Am I talking too far off our agenda here? So we took, as you can see there, everybody, this is the audience, and the Annies are in blue, and this is our Mrs. Mark's characters, but we had a screen here. And so as part of our show, we took one of the particular Annie characters, I'm going to show you here, and behind her on the screen is an image of a naked woman swimming underwater. It's this great, glorious female sexual dream. orgasmic dream. And this girl is, or this Annie, this version of our Annie, is trying to sing like an opera singer. So with us, we saw the oppression not as Annie having to choose between getting married or going over to the mainland and working in a factory. It was all about the experience of learning to speak, or being a really good girl because you could articulate something, or being a really bad girl because your vocal cords couldn't articulate these sounds that you can't literally hear as a deaf person. And also being punished for signing, which was the experience of all of our company members. So this girl just falls into a reverie. We had a piece of opera beautifully sung by Maeve O'Rourke, and I, up at the top of the auditorium, did I'm also a magpie in terms of my references. I did a not I where I put a torch on my mouth so that Paula, this actor, could read my lips at the start. It was an Italian opera piece of Monteverdi, and she could follow my lips, and then I closed it off and she could just fall into this beautiful reverie about what the equivalent for us was the flaming red dress, the green emerald dress. I think she talked about, she has a couple of terms for her great fantasy of expressing herself and being free and being liberated. So this was where we made that happen within our production, I suppose.
Thank you, Amanda. And Jonathan, to come back to you, I suppose we've heard a lot of examples there of the many opportunities Deevy's work presents to us, and also some of the challenges. Would you like to comment there about, from your experience, what were some of those opportunities that you saw in that work and bringing it to the audience in America?
Sure. For me, and I find I don't find a distinction between opportunities and challenges. I think they're synonymous. I think most theater makers feel that way. You have to consider your challenges to be opportunities, and an interesting opportunity is probably a challenging opportunity. But for me, the key thing with Deevy goes maybe to that question of overwritten versus underwritten. I guess where I land is that it's neither. It's perfectly written, in the sense that what I think Deevy does that has, I think, very little to do with being Irish or female or deaf, but has more to do with her genius as a writer, is, or maybe has everything to do with all those things, but it turns, but I understand it as her genius as a writer is her ability to create real humans who hold contradictory desires and feelings in every moment. So the challenge of the work is really for an actor to be able to live that contradiction. And the opportunity is to create a real human being, or to kind of live up to the complexity of the writing, the psychological complexity of the writing. And that has, I never thought about, I mean, there was no place for me to think about how am I going to kind of translate this work for an American audience. I'm an American. I mean, I consider a director to be kind of straddling, standing in for the audience and representing the author, or not representing the author, but attempting to understand the author, but from the perspective of the audience. What I really feel is that my job as a director is to deliver to the audience the experience I have in reading the play, so that my first exposure to the play, becomes the touchstone of what I'm trying to make sure happens for an audience. And so my first exposure to Deevy's work was kind of wonderment, and not clarity, but confusion. And I didn't think that I never felt that my job was to clarify, meaning to choose between multiple interpretations. That my job was to allow, or to enable, or to hope that the living contradictions in every moment breathed. And that an audience had the experience of being in the room with humans who were struggling.
And if I can just add to that, actually, this is
sure.
an interesting point, actually, Jonathan, and I think, Lianne, maybe you can help out here, because we desperately wanted to make a feminist piece of work. Of course, we were literally in the wave of Waking the Feminists, but we found our experience, the company's experience, and also in the play, was this great idea of this young woman who wanted to be liberated, and the older generation of women stopping her doing that. So this Mrs. Marks, Annie, dichotomy. And so it was terribly, you do like a nice tidy narrative of all women working together, when we know this is the fantasy, but that complexity was really interesting. It allowed us to speak to the actuality of real life and real life experiences in some way, that it's not all beautifully tidied up and with neat hems.
Yes. Lianne, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that it is what we really looked at, how women oppressed other women, and certainly whether it's hearing women oppressing deaf women, but we really reflected on our experiences of deaf children being brought up in the way that we were, forced into oralism. Actually, I think at the end of our production, we did a scene with hairbrushes, where when Annie, as Amanda just described, has this fantasy, she is bashed by the other Annies with hairbrushes. So the symbolic female prop or object. So she's literally bashed in those terms. She is in a parallel way to the way that Mrs. Marks tells Annie to get over herself and marry a man. But we then inflected it again, and we turned the hairbrushes around, as they were white hairbrushes with the rectangular back, and we made them into these like placards for protest, which is a glorious thing that we did. Amanda is going to try and share her screen here with you. I'm double jabbing here to show you these. Hang on a minute, Lianne. Yeah. Where do we have the bashing? I think we have the bashing here. Can you see that? There's Lianne with the hairbrush in her hand. And then we turn it around and we have images of us staging this protest. Lianne, do you want to tell them about the context in terms of ISL? Yeah. at the time when we made the production, Lianne is saying, we really wanted to promote awareness of ISL to the mainstream audience, as I've already said, but ISL was not legally recognised at the time. And actually we got legal recognition literally 3 months after. And, you know, we do say that the art community's acceptance of our language was certainly an amazing way of giving us confidence in our language, giving a kind of recognition, and certainly in the National Theatre of Ireland, recognising our language and putting it on the stage was really significant in those terms as well.
Thank you.
I'll stop sharing now, sorry.
Not at all. And Caroline, you mentioned, let me just bring back the double jobbing, I'm doing it as well now. Caroline, you mentioned that you were trying to find a way of responding to the expressionistic elements. So, and you mentioned that you worked with the dramaturg, and the more you got into the text of Katie Roach, the more you found your way. So what were some of the crucial decisions for you in responding to that text, and particularly around the style, since you mentioned that?
I guess Reuben was the key character for me that was tapping into the kind of expressionism of the play, because he's this kind of magical, strange creature, and he feels mythic. So I guess how he and a naturalistic kind of set work together for me was a bit of a dilemma. That was a bit of a red flag when I read it originally. So I wanted to start with him, and I wanted to start with a world where he would fit in a kind of logic. And so that was really important for me, that he was kind of born out of a kind of psychic space for her. So in terms of how I developed the production with the dramaturg, is that I guess I really started with the design elements of it, and how the materials that Katie is surrounded by are an expression of her inner kind of psychology. So I used a lot of soil to represent, I guess, her relationship with the earth, with the river, with the outside, and then I kind of couple that with marble, so that as she is kind of exploring her greatness, this marble floor is underneath her. And the idea of like her desire, this woman is potentially an architect in the making, except Stan just keeps kind of squashing her down. And so that the marble then is underneath the soil, and it is born from a kind of fossils. And then I was interested in glass, because when I spoke to Chris Mora, she talked about her reality as a deaf woman, that he said that there's an image that kind of captured Teresa Deevy when she started to move into radio dramas, that she would be sitting behind a glass booth lip reading people. So I really wanted to use those elements to represent Katie. So glass and soil and marble were the things that I used to express the kind of dilemmas that the character was working through and her aspirations. And I really liked the clash of the soil and the marble. And I didn't want to represent a kind of cottage. I wanted to see if the cottage could be contained within an expressionistic set. And I felt like that actually can happen. And so that's really what I pursued, both with the dramaturg and also with the set designer as well, that we could create this world where she could live and fulfill herself and not fulfill herself, and also that the kind of ideogrammatic language of the play would be really strong, just like Amanda was saying about not being overly concerned with the language of it, that there was a visual language that expressed the character's desires as well, and often bypassed the language. So that's the kind of work that I make, is that the semiotics of the stage are actually really commenting on the character's dilemma, not just the language. And there was something slightly untrustworthy a little bit about the language at times. And so I wanted Katie to have a life in spite of the language, beyond the language, in contradiction to the language. And that was where like the visual life of the play for me was really exciting. And also when I started researching the play, I put together all the stage directions, and out of an 80-page script, there was 20 pages of stage directions, which for me as a theatre director is massively unusual. So I actually did a workshop at the Young Vic with the play, just looking purely at it as stage directions, because I was interested in how the writer was using stage directions to kind of command the play, not necessarily always trusting the language. And then looking at these silences, and there was 53 silences written into the play as well. So I was using these as clues as to what Deevy wanted in terms of the action of the play. And that language was kind of coming out of the action or the world of the play rather than just the actual thing. So that's where I began, with the stage directions, the silences, and looking at how I could create a visual world that would be like a playground for Katie to be able to express herself as an artist. And so she created all these land art with the soil, and worked with the materials, because I felt this was an artist without a medium. That's what I felt about Katie Roach, that her greatness was actually her artistic expression. She just couldn't get an out. So that's how I work on my production.
Thank you. And it's just so interesting to hear the connections between the approaches emerging. So the timekeeper has told me and given me instruction, but I suppose just if we could take a few more minutes just to briefly comment, was one of the themes that has also come out of this discussion is the importance of the relationship with your creative team in bringing these plays to life, so that it moves beyond language into the visual. And Jonathan, would you like to maybe give us a little bit of an insight into how you worked with your creative team staging Deevy's, the many works that you staged in the Mint?
Well, I've staged four complete productions. The fourth production was 4 short plays, including King of Spain's Daughter. But so that's a lot of different creative teams getting a lot of different, having a lot of different conversations. Although my set designer has been consistent throughout, and she and I are longtime collaborators. And I think maybe just to focus in on Katie Roach, and we did have a cottage, but in the challenge, we kind of had a ground plan, and and knew we weren't done, and it's kind of the most assertive I am, contrary to my colleagues here today. And, the question was, for us, how to help the audience see the end of the play the way we did, and when I say the way we did, we felt the way Deevy intended, and not with a concern for the year in which we were producing it, nor with a concern for the year in which she wrote it, but just with a concern for the text. And so we made some very specific decisions about how to help tell the story. And we're recording this now in December, but in February our production is going to be available online as a stream. So when people are watching this, so I don't want to kind of give away exactly what we did, but I would say it was something that I felt was really bold, and I think it went completely unnoticed as a bold directorial move, which I think is, for me, kind of a sign of its success, in that it felt like it was intended, and basically, we just wanted to see a moment past the final moment of the play, and I'll leave it at that. But the stage directions, it's always interesting to me, the directors who feel that the first thing they want to do is black out stage directions. There's so much information that Deevy wants us to have there. And as having edited, 2 volumes of her work, which means proofreading plays time and time and time again. It's where she puts the stage directions is actually critical. I mean, she doesn't tell an actor how to say a line. She writes the line and then gives the direction after the fact, that you should understand how just in case you're confused about what was intended by that line, here's a little more information. But she doesn't, it's not really a instruction. It's additional information by and large.
Thank you. Anyone else want to make a final comment on the all-important collaboration with the creative team? Lianne?
So for us, the creative team, am I on the right? Yes. For us, our creative team, the big thing was that we were completely invested in promoting ISL awareness. And we played during ISL Awareness Week, an embodied piece of work, an immersive piece of theatre. You came into our world in both physical and visual ways. No, so, I mean, the sign language that was used in Ireland almost 100 last century is very different to what we use today. So really we mixed between women's gendered signs of the 30s to young women, girls signs now. And yeah, Amanda is I'm going to speak as myself here. I really say, because we chatted about this an awful lot, myself and Lianne, as we were preparing for you here. Isabel, are you good to translate for me there? I'm not on gallery view. You're good, Isabel. And really, just to talk this phenomena of the gendered nature of Irish Sign Language is just also really anthropologically, sociologically unique in the world, but really, really interesting, obviously, as first language users, all of us in the company. And so I think what we call women's signs was really major conversation with the creative team, and a really major conversation because all our creative team were women. All of us were sign language users. Most of us, except me, were deaf. So actually to have the resource, we had the resource within our company to do this first-hand research on what the signs for, how did women say the Hail Mary, which is one of those ritual things that you just speak without considering the individual words, you know what I mean, in those kind of ways. How did they do this? How did they say black? How did they say white? Why did they say white? And Lianne's better at showing this than me, but like the sign for white, we made into a whole poetic gesture. And actually very beautifully, this is because they used to wear white gloves, all of that lovely detail of, actually we could really, really read into the 20s and 30s that the women in the deaf school, and Teresa Deevy obviously didn't go to the deaf school, but her colleagues who were deaf wore white gloves when they went for their walks. And that's why that's the sign for white, as in like my gloves. Or there's other kind of context, Lianne. White, we used water as we were translating the Drover poem within the play. Mm-hmm. So their sign for water, women's sign for water, this is water we use every day, which is the St. Joseph Boys sign. And then their sign for water is this shimmering, glittering beautiful things. So it also helped with all of the poetry in the gestures that we were trying to work
bring
with.
out.
Like, yeah.
Jonathan, you had your hand raised. Did you want to come in there?
Well, I assume maybe everybody who was watching this knows, and I raised my hand before you mentioned that obviously Teresa did not go to the deaf school, or I just think it's important to point out that she didn't lose her hearing until she was in her early 20s, and that
no, you're absolutely right, Jonathan. We were very much coming from it from our perspective as culturally deaf, I suppose, people who are using sign language. But it was really interesting to that both yourself and Caroline talked about the direct stage directions, and I would say from a deaf perspective that's completely, you contextualize everything in the visual, in the vision that you're seeing. And also in our research, we found that her sister interpreted for her quite a lot, and she was very much a bridge to the world. And I think there was, Lianne, am I wrong? There was some comments that when her sister died before her, she was very isolated.
Yes.
So there was a lot of those interrelationships with the world. If you're fronting in the world, like speaking from an embodied perspective, you're fronting onto the world, and this is your most important sense.
I think even there it's important to just clarify that you used the word her sister interpreted, but her sister didn't sign. She did, that was they. Yes. Communication.
It's not the formal way that we have sign language interpreters. It's not Isabel. It's not me. In other part, I'm a professional interpreter in other parts of my life. It's not like that at all. But certainly, what we talk about is home signs, and I think, Lianne, you came across some evidence of home signs, so small, intimate gestures that two people would have the understanding for. And certainly her sister was a communicator in whatever way that was, whether she spoke more clearly that Teresa could understand her, or whatever way it happened, she had a conduit within her sister.
Yes.
To the hearing world or the mainstream world.
Well, I know we could stay here for much longer and talk so much more about the wonderful work you've created with Deevy's work, and thank you so much for just sharing your process and just giving us an insight into a very real and honest insight into what it was like working with her text in the very beginning. And it's not often we get to hear that, so I mean that's been really exciting for me. Una, would you like to say a few words?
Just to echo those thanks, the generosity of you giving your time and sharing your expertise and your insights into Deevy is so useful for us, Kate and I, in the work that we're doing, and for our students, and for people who want to think more about Deevy. It's so helpful, and thank you so much for joining us today, and to our viewers at home.
Thanks for joining in.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Isabel, for joining us as well, and to Ken McCarthy in the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning for being on hand in case of difficulties. We'd also like to thank the School of Humanities at WIT and our colleague Hugh Murphy in Maynooth Library, where the Teresa Deevy archive is located. So you have some homework to do after this video around stage directions and going to the library. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks a million.